Welcome, everyone. This is your friend, the DN What If, here with another exciting fanfiction. Today, we're diving into the story of What If Deku Was Haunted by Nightmares No One Could Ignore? If you enjoy this video, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more fanfiction content just like this. Now, let's get started with the fanfic. Screaming. Someone was screaming on the second floor of the UE student dorms late that night. It must have been well past midnight, and not a soul was awake. But through the silence cut a sound of pure, overwhelming terror that could be heard through the entire building. Everyone woke to it, and not a single person let themselves go back to sleep in its wake. It wasn't as if nightmares were uncommon for the freshman class of UE. They'd seen plenty of things, heard and felt and witnessed enough travesty in their lives so far to last them a lifetime. No one grudged each other for their night terrors. They'd all had them. But this scream. No one would roll over and go back to bed. It was terror and anguish intermingled, too much to be trivial. And the one behind the scream. No one, not even Bakugo Katsuki, could ignore it. Midoriya Izuku was screaming. Midoriya Izuku is 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 screaming. Midoriya Izuku is. But Midoriya Izuku was not a night terror sort of boy. He was the sort to be found at 3 in the morning staring with unseeing eyes at the ceiling in the main room. He was the kind of boy that all the other students sought out when they had night terrors. He was always patient and understanding, and no one ever left his company feeling uncertain. Midoriya Izuku had never woken anyone before with his own terrors. The screaming wasn't stopping. Long, endless seconds and minutes of his shrieking filled the air. There was a frozen tension across the floor. No one moved. No one breathed. And then everyone went running. Kirishima was the first to throw open his door, as he was the room just above Midoriya's, but Tokoyami and Mineta were the first to Midoriya's door. In quick succession, students pooled into the second-floor hallway, where Midoriya's cries were loudest. No words were spoken, the screaming drowning out all their thoughts. Even Mineta, who was surrounded by women in their night clothes, who were thoughtless about putting on actual pants when they rushed for Midoriya, said nothing. Shock made him forget himself. What's wrong with Midoriya? What's happening? Is he okay? Everyone wondered the same questions. Tokoyami's dark shadow broke open the door, and a few students shoved their way into the dark room. The room was engulfed in darkness. Not even the stars or the moon shined in through the window. The light switch was flicked on and off, but nothing came on. Nothing but darkness, and the piercing wails coming from farther into the room. It was Bakugo Katsuki who finally approached the bed, and Todoroki Shudo who lit the room with a blaze. From his palm, Midoriya Izuku was splayed across his mattress, covers battered and thrown everywhere, body constricted and looking like he was being held down by some great, invisible thing. His screaming didn't stop. His cries sounded raw by this point, having been screaming for minutes now. Bakugo leaned forward, and no one but Todoroki, who leaned close over his shoulder to provide light, saw as he put a gentle hand to Midoriya's face. No one but Todoroki saw his thumb swipe over Midoriya's cheek, almost affectionately. No one but Todoroki saw the strange, pale look that passed over Bakugo's face in that moment before Midoriya finally jolted away from Bakugo's hand and woke. The screaming stopped, but in its place was heavy panting and anguished sobs. At that moment, the lights finally flickered weakly to life. The residents of the dorms, all gathered at the threshold of Midoriya Izuku's door, were brought into focus. And so was Midoriya. He was in ruins. His eyes were glassy and shot, widened by some lingering horror that had not left him. His hair was sticking in all directions and his clothes were in disarray, like he'd been struggling. There was a look about him that spelled complete and utter travesty. And all that could be heard were his choked breaths, as he tried to rein himself in. As his haunted eyes took them all in, standing there, staring at him as if he were on the brink of death. And then, "I'm sorry," he sobbed breathlessly. As his shoulders collapsed inward, as his head fell and hid the remains of his suffering from them. "I'm sorry." As though he had anything to be sorry for. "Midoriya," Todoroki said softly, his face softening in that way, crumbling like he were ashamed of himself because Midoriya had even thought he had to apologize. The other students looked at each other uncertainly. Midoriya Izuku was akin to All Might in composure. He was righteous and steadfast. He was a hard punch and a shot of adrenaline in the heat of a fight. He was the one you went to for a good laugh, and a laugh you would recognize anywhere. He was a ray of sunshine. So, what could they possibly do when the pillar of hope in their standalone group of amateur heroes began to collapse? Who would shoulder his burdens when he had always been the one to shoulder theirs? Midoriya began again, shuddering. "Don't apologize," Bakugo cut in firmly. All eyes shifted to him. Todoroki couldn't read the look on his face as he stared down at Midoriya, but there was no menace in him, no anger there. It was Kirishima, who knew Bakugo better than all of them, who sensed a shift in his explosive friend. "Bakugo," he said quietly, trying to get his friend to look at him. Bakugo's gaze cut sharply at Kirishima, bristling as though he'd forgotten the rest of them were there. "What?" And still there was no rage. At that moment, Uraraka shoved forward through the crowd. She forced her way in between Bakugo and Midoriya, standing as a wall that shielded the gasping boy from all the others. Her expression was pure steel. Her stance spelled protection and a warning that she would hurt anyone that got too near. "Get out," she demanded. "All of you, leave him alone." No one moved. Those by the threshold that had said nothing inched back slightly, but Bakugo, Todoroki, Kirishima and Ida stood their ground. As though they expected to be exceptions from her demand. Uraraka stared directly at Bakugo, driven quite clearly by the past that Midoriya and Bakugo had, and repeated, "Get out." His mouth tightened, and she could see the words there. The venom he could strike with. The curses he might spew. By this time, everyone else had moved out but the handful of them. "Deku," Bakugo said instead, startling all of them. His voice careful and low. "What do you want? What do you want?" He'd asked, and the words echoed. Uraraka didn't seem to care what he asked, or what he meant. She raised her body tall, tone icy, and near snarled at him. "What are you saying? Get out. He doesn't want you of all people hanging around to see him right now." "Bakugo, man," Kirishima tried again, hesitating to think of what his best friend could possibly be thinking. But Bakugo was unflinching. "Deku," he said again, just as evenly. No one had been paying quite as much attention to him since Uraraka had cut him off from everyone else. But Deku lifted his head then, face pale and eyes red and his mouth set in a grim line. He took a steady breath, already composed in the few seconds it took for the rest of them to argue. "Go," Midoriya said. He looked utterly withdrawn, but his voice was steady. He was a closed book at this point. Whatever had haunted him just a minute ago, it was hidden from them all now. Uraraka looked triumphant, staring up at Bakugo's face, seeing but not processing as she watched his face shift from intent to reserved. Like he had expected a different outcome. "See?" "No," Midoriya said in the same flat, unyielding tone. "All of you, go." Even Ida, who had remained quiet through all of this, startled at that. Even Bakugo blanched. "What?" Uraraka said, turning to face Midoriya. "But Deku after all that?" He shook his head at her, pushing off the remainders of his covers. Bakugo's eyes followed the shaking movements of his hands with laser point focus. "I'm sorry for waking you all up and causing you such distress." He stood slowly, cautiously, and the others recognized signs of intense muscle fatigue, and that Midoriya was one wrong move from his legs giving out. They followed him to the door, where Midoriya held it open for them to leave. When he stared at them again, meeting their worried gazes with a firm one of his own. Kirishima and the others would remember that look forever, would remember the heaviness in his eyes as he stared at them. Would remember the intensity, like he was holding up some kind of facade with all that he had left in him, like the moment they left it would all come crashing back down on him. would remember the intent way he stared at each of them, like he was trying to memorize them, in that moment, like he had seen something in his nightmares that had convinced him of some horrific truth. It was that night that some of the students gathered there realized, just a little bit, of how heavy Midoriya's burdens were. Because he looked kind of like All Might, in the faint lighting, with a smile like that. Uraraka was crying when she threw herself at Midoriya, tackling him in a hug, knuckles white as she gripped tightly to him. Ida was right behind her, if only just so he could steady Midoriya when his legs gave out. Then, when Ida managed to wrestle Uraraka off Midoriya, they said their farewells and vanished into the dark hallway. Todoroki exchanged a quiet few words with Izuku before he left too. And Kirishima just gripped Midoriya on the shoulder in a comforting sort of way, and reminded him that he was there to talk to. And then it was only Bakugo and Midoriya. This won't happen again, Midoriya told him, and Bakugo realized that the green-haired boy thought that he would be angry. Angry, or ashamed of him. As though his traumatizing nightmares and how they ravaged Midoriya was something that made him weak. Don't. Bakugo said softly. Midoriya's gaze shot up to meet his. Don't say things like that. Kaken. Just. He stared out into the empty hallway, staring past the intense gaze that Midoriya pinned him with, and there was something uncommonly gentle about Bakugo in the dying light with the shadows softening the bright red of his eyes. Talk to someone. Tell someone. Don't pretend it isn't bad. It'll only get worse. Midoriya's ghosts were shifting behind his eyes when Bakugo glanced back at him one last time. Bakugo had the succinct feeling that he was one of them. Midoriya Izuku is late for class the next morning. The class of 1A is idly standing by their desks, crowded together but always with the door to the classroom within the corner of their eyes. The seconds on the clock were ticking away audibly in the worried silence. The events of the night before haven't left anyone's mind. There's a scowl on Bakugo Katsuki's face, and it appears normal enough that no one looks too closely. But Kirishima is quiet, uncharacteristically so, and he keeps glancing at his explosive friend. Everyone's off kilter and no one notices the small things. No one is thinking of how Bakugo reached for Midoriya last night. No one is remembering the way Bakugo spoke to him last night. No one is noticing anything but Midoriya's empty desk. I'm worried about him, Uraraka tells Ida, loud enough that the rest of the murmuring, concerned students hear her. Her voice is verging a bit on hysterical, and no one blames her. He wouldn't talk to us last night, and he hasn't been answering my texts. I even knocked on his door this morning and he didn't answer. Ida looked like he wanted to be reassuring, to say that Midoriya was probably just fine. But if he were honest, and he always strived to be, he didn't feel that Midoriya was fine at all. Last night had been the worst that anyone had ever seen Midoriya. Worse, even, than he'd been after Bakugo had been captured that night by the villains. Midoriya-kun, Momo Yaoyorozu began hesitantly from her seat towards the back of class. The look on her face was tentative. From what I know of him, he has always been a very bright and optimistic kid. I could never imagine. Does anyone know if he's had nightmares like that before? It was Mineta who shook his head. Never. Yuga Aoyama added, as though just realizing that he knew. Actually, now that I think about it, I don't think Midoriya sleeps well. Most nights he leaves his room when most of us go up to sleep, and he comes back really early in the morning before anyone wakes up usually. Kirishima perked up. That's true, he said. Sometimes when I can't sleep, I can find him wandering around the building. From the side of the room, no one noticed Bakugo snap out of his thoughts. The only evidence that he was listening was the way he turned his ear to the conversation, his face ever so carefully empty of interest. Tokoyami nodded at that. Midoriya's the best person to talk to when you can't sleep. Both Ishido and Kaminari glanced at each other, nodding sagely. Kaminari leaned forward from where he sat on a desk. I found him in the main room one night just staring at the ceiling. I went over to say hey, and next thing I know I'm sitting there pouring my guts out to him, and then Ishido walks in. It was totally surreal, the three of us bonding in the middle of the night like that. She smiles a little reminiscently. Yeah, Midoriya's the sweetest. He can really understand people, you know? Makes you feel a little lighter after talking to him. The room sounded with hums of agreement. Midoriya Izuku, who had no friends in middle school and little hope of ever becoming a hero, had come a long way since then. Most of them might not know him that well, but their admiration of the boy was blatant. Despite never having anyone there for him as a kid, he was unreasonably caring and kind. No one had really given it much thought why they could always find him in the dead of night somewhere around the building. No one had ever put two and two together and realized Midoriya Izuku wasn't sleeping. Because Midoriya at night, in the moonlight that poured in through the windows, was a novelty. His kind face was soft and his voice was gentle, and when people spoke, he gave them his rapt attention. He gave off a comforting vibe that let people take a load off and voice their deepest thoughts. But maybe, did anyone ever think of what was going on with him? Did anyone ever wonder if he was getting enough sleep, or if he had anyone to tell his own problems to? Wasn't selfishness. Midoriya would never blame anyone for not asking, because he was good at holding himself together. He was used to being on his own, dealing with things on his own, keeping all his problems to himself. That was just Midoriya Izuku. The clock ticked, seconds from the first bell ringing to begin first PRD. A strange sort of tension filled the air, as if collectively they were all thinking the same thing. Someone should go check on him. Ashido declared. There was an uproar of agreement, people raising their hands and volunteering to go. But they were only seconds away from first PRD, and Aizawa-sensei wasn't likely to be late for that. Bakugo slammed a fist on his desk, startling everyone out of their mob mentality. Shitty glasses, Bakugo snapped, breaking the spell. Do your FING job. No one's leaving. And with that, Ida sprang into action, remembering himself. He scolded the kids sitting on desks, and had everyone in their seats and at attention by the time Aizawa-sensei slunk in wearing his sleeping bag and began attendance. No one thinks anything of Bakugo's outburst. No one sees his hands curl into fists under his desk. No one looks close enough to see that Bakugo Katsuki isn't angry for once, he's worried. No one sees anything but Midoriya's empty desk. Kirishima knows Bakugo, though. They've been friends for months now, one of the few people that Bakugo had deemed to be strong enough to acknowledge. So Kirishima knows that there are circles beneath Bakugo's eyes despite how he tries to hide them with a scowl. Kirishima knows that something is off, and he thinks he gets it now. There has always been a disconnect between Midoriya and Bakugo, a divide that could make oceans look like puddles, and has expanded even more so ever since they began studying here at Yui. Midoriya found other friends and began to grow stronger and more confident since being away from Bakugo, and Bakugo had seemed to mellow out in response. It had seemed like the two childhood friends no longer had a reason to interfere with each other again, especially recently. Kirishima hadn't seen Bakugo and Midoriya so much as look at each other in months. Yet he can't help but try to recall if he'd ever wondered if Bakugo ever missed Midoriya. Had Kirishima ever looked to see if Bakugo wanted to close the gap between them, to rebuild the bridges he'd once burned to ash? They had a long history together, after all. They were just about equals in a fight, both strong and strategic at once. Kirishima would even privately say that they could be incredible friends, if only they didn't have a history of hurt between them. But Kirishima had seen Bakugo grow up a little during the months they'd known each other. He was confident that, given time, maybe they could be just as close as they once were. Bakugo walked out of school in between PRDs. He didn't tell anyone where he was going. It would have been hard to explain. That he was going to find Midoriya. He wasn't sure he knew the words himself for why he was cutting school to find the kid he hadn't been friends with since they were toddlers. The dorms were silent when he walked in, walked up the stairs to the second floor and to the door they had all crowded into last night. Midoriya Izuku's dorm room. Bakugo lifted a hand to knock, but paused. What could he even say if Midoriya was there? How could he explain himself? He didn't think, Deku, get your effing useless but back to school, would be very friendly. He didn't mean it. He didn't want to be cruel. Not anymore. Sighing, he rubbed his hands over his face. He'd just have to figure something out, because he couldn't waste any more time thinking too hard on how he should behave around Midoriya now. Things were different now, that much was for sure. How different, though, he couldn't be certain. He knocked on the door. He waited. The vacant hallway seemed to peer judgmentally at him, as though behind all the closed doors waited students that would come out any second and demand to know what he was doing. Why he was there. The long moments ticked by. He waited. And waited. "Deku," he called through the door. Nothing. "Deku, come on." There was a strange feeling raising in his shoulders, and Bakugo couldn't tell if it was irritation or anxiety. "Open the door." Still, nothing but silence met his calls. Not a peep came from inside the dorm room. So Bakugo put his hand on the knob and turned it. The door was unlocked. He pushed the door open just a little, startled. Why would it be open? Bakugo waited to see if he could hear anything from the inside, then he shoved the door the rest of the way and braced himself for anything suspicious. But the room was empty. Glancing around the hallway, making sure no one saw him, he stepped inside. Bakugo peered over the made-up bed, and the school uniform laid out on the chair. He couldn't remember if he'd seen the uniform spread out there last night, like Midoriya had planned on wearing it today. Bakugo searched the room for something, anything that might tell him where Midoriya had gone. He searched, and yet he found he couldn't look too hard at anything. Everything was too personal, too Deku. From the All Might posters plastered all over his walls, to the photos taped to the wall. "I'm sorry." Bakugo shivered as memories from last night struck him. Midoriya, curled up with his head in his hands, shaking, sobbing in the aftermath of his terror. Midoriya, looking as though he had peered into the eyes of death. Midoriya, looking at him just before he left, in the grim lighting, his face sickly and pale, his eyes veiled in shadow and clouded by ghosts. "I'm sorry." Bakugo clenched his fists at his side, digging his nails into his palms, anything to distract himself from all that had happened here last night. "What?" Bakugo breathes. "Have you ever had to be sorry about, Deku?" "Nothing." Bakugo didn't think there was anything at all. There were pictures on Midoriya's wall. Bakugo, eyes hazy from the memories that threatened to overwhelm him, didn't realize he'd been staring at them until he blinked back the things he'd seen last night. There were some in frames on the desk, some taped to the wall. It was clear that they were there for him to look at when he sat down to study, as if to remind himself of what he was striving for. As if he was reminding himself of why he kept walking the path of a hero, why he suffered so keenly for it. On the wall were many pictures. Almost all new. Almost all from freshman year. Midoriya standing at the UE gate with Uraraka and Ida. Midoriya at the mall with everyone in class. Midoriya in his gym uniform during the tournament. A picture taken from a newspaper of him facing off against Todoroki, the moment that Todoroki had let his flames burn. There were older pictures too. Framed ones. Midoriya in his hero costume standing beside his mother. Her eyes were watery, but she had a proud smile on her face. And Midoriya? Bakugo didn't know how long he stared. Didn't know how long he watched Midoriya's smiling face, the gentle, peaceful look on his face. Didn't know why it struck him so hard, that he didn't think he had ever seen Midoriya so collected and confident, didn't know why he'd never noticed how grown up he looked. There was another. Of Midoriya and All Might, standing together. They were at a beach, standing together. All Might had an arm around Midoriya's shoulders, and Midoriya was smiling like he'd never been happier. Like he'd been released of some great, incredible burden. Bakugo tries to remember the last time he'd witnessed that brilliant smile flashed his way. He tries not to think of all the times Midoriya had looked at him with tears in his eyes, how every time he'd looked at him in the last few months, the very few times they'd even locked eyes, Midoriya had worn these dark eyes, this looked like he was coming to terms with something grievous. Like he was accepting the closing door between Bakugo and himself, finally coming to terms with the uncrossable distance between them. Bakugo steps back from the pictures, sets himself down heavily on Midoriya's made-up bed. His head is hazy with Izuku, with that brilliant smile at first, or the teary-eyed look of a much younger version of the green-haired boy. But Bakugo closes his eyes against them, keeps seeing the look in Midoriya's eyes as he turned to go, seeing the shadows move behind his eyes. He keeps seeing more than himself there, realizing that Midoriya was beginning to look older. Like a pro-hero. Bakugo opened his eyes, seeing Midoriya look at him in last night's eerie light, seeing him look at him with a smile that did not match the heaviness in his gaze. Bakugo realized that Midoriya was beginning to look a little like All Might when he smiled. like the world was bearing down on him. But he would never let anyone else try to shoulder it instead. Something beeped in the room, startling Bakugo and jolting him to his feet. A light was flashing on the laptop. He went over to it and tapped the keyboard, too struck by his memories to think of how this might be an intrusion of privacy. But in retrospect, he was here to find Midoriya. He had to look for clues. The laptop screen lit up, revealing Midoriya's email. He'd received 2 replies. One from Aizawa-sensei and the other from All Might? Bakugo, sparing a moment to remind himself he shouldn't be going through the other boys' things, clicked on the email anyway. He read the previous message before reading Aizawa-sensei's reply. Dear Aizawa-sensei, I won't be attending class today. I'll be sure to get the notes from Uraraka-san and meet with you before class tomorrow to discuss making up work. I'm sorry for troubling you. Respectfully, Midoriya Izuku. Aizawa's reply was short. Bakugo snorted at the reply, making sure to hit unread before moving on to All Might's messages. Izuku had wrote to him. Dear All Might, the nightmares are getting worse, so I'm going to take your advice. I'm going home today. I need to spend some time with my mother, to reassure her and myself. I'm sorry for causing you such trouble. I'll be sure to be back in class tomorrow in better form. Thank you. Sincerely, Midoriya Izuku. Bakugo marveled at the informality of the email. The evident closeness between Midoriya Izuku and All Might. But his eyes flickered to the photograph of Midoriya and the number 1 hero, and thought back to the night All Might had allowed him to know the burden he'd set on Midoriya's shoulders. He thought back to the night, and how far away they'd become after that. Somewhere in Bakugo, his hatred towards Izuku puttered out that night. Bakugo had shoved down whatever had replaced it, and the two had hardly talked since. Reading Midoriya's words now, seeing him growing up through photographs, that something that Bakugo had shoved down was coming back up, crawling up his spine. Maybe it was because he'd realized that night that Midoriya Izuku was not the same boy he'd grown up knowing. Maybe he'd realized that night that Midoriya was fierce and steadfast, not a little boy anymore. He was old enough and smart enough now that he'd be able to tell just what had changed in Bakugo by looking at him. That Midoriya might see something in Bakugo that shouldn't be. Bakugo stepped away from the computer, something in his chest clenching. He knew where he had to go now. He knew where to look for the boy he'd come here to get. Classes be'd med. He'd cut at least a PRD or 2 already at this point, so what was the harm in leaving for the rest of it? There was something more important he had to be doing, someone more important that he had to see. Bakugo went to close the laptop, noticing a turned-over picture frame. He told himself not to pry any further. He had what he needed. He knew where he had to go. But the frame was dusty, despite the recent move and despite all the pictures being too recent for this much dust. It was scratched a bit, maybe from age and being jostled over time. And when Bakugo picked it up, he felt the cracks in the glass before he saw them. There, in the picture frame, was a photo of himself and Midoriya. They were just kids. All muddy and grinning like fools, ignorant of the people they would grow up to become not too many years later. This photo was from before the time his quirk manifested. Before Izuku became a quirkless loser. Before everything that they'd expected to have, before everything they believed the world owed them was lost forever. Minute. Bakugo, a voice sounded at the open door. Bakugo only showed Todoroki Shudo the photo, cracked frame and all, before he set it back down on the desk, face up this time. I'm gonna bring him back, Bakugo said to him, with none of his usual aggression. And Todoroki, who had seen the gentle way Bakugo had reached out to Midoriya the night before, who had been standing there in the doorway for minutes already, watching Bakugo stare down at the portrait like the things he knew to be real were hanging by a thread. Todoroki only nodded to him, stepping aside silently when Bakugo walked back out the door. They shut the door behind them, and in a fragile sort of companionship, they walked out of the dorm facilities together. They went their separate ways after that. Bakugo went off to find Midoriya, and Todoroki returned to school. When Todoroki walked back into lunch late, everyone watched him anxiously for news. He merely shook his head and said, I think Midoriya-kun is in good hands. To be continued in Part 3. Midoriya Izuku was not the type for self-pity. He had a lot to be grateful for, A lot of people in his life that had supported him and molded him into the person he was today. Where he was now in his life, he could hardly ask for more. He'd come from being completely and utterly alone, his only friend doubling as his tormentor. He'd come from loneliness like most could never understand, and a dream that had seemed absolutely unreachable. Yet here he was. A student at UE, the best hero academy in the country. He was the apprentice of All Might, the #1 hero. He had a quirk now, and a kick-ass one at that. And he had so many more friends than he had ever imagined having. Real, good friends that cared about him and treated him like family. There was nothing more he could ask for. Everything he had ever dreamed was coming true. He was on his way to succeeding the great All Might. But with every gain there came a cost. His nightmares never failed to remind him of that. His nightmares are often the same. At first they were just memories. Kakin and him as kids, and every confrontation they'd had since Midoriya was found to be quirkless. He saw burning, vicious red. Animalistic aggression pinpointed at him. He'd been beaten and degraded and humiliated again, and again, and again. By the one boy he had ever called a friend. He saw Bakugo Katsuki, then and now, and he saw a bridge that could never be repaired between them. It begins in the dark. He's just a kid. 5 or 6 at best, and he feels utterly raw. Bakugo Katsuki is standing over him, red eyes vicious and burning. Animalistic aggression pinpointed at him. There's a tangible emptiness in his chest where he thinks he used to feel warm. Kakin, he can hear himself sob. Kakin. Bakugo is older, all of a sudden. 15 and grown, teeth sharper, gaze more deadly. Midoriya looks into his face and he sees death written in every crevice. He's dressed in his hero suit, and Midoriya feels it when Bakugo puts a gloved hand to his chest and lets off an explosion aimed to kill. For a moment, Midoriya thinks he's woken up. He blinks a few times, realizing he must have fallen asleep in class at his desk. Uraraka is standing at his side, but her face is indistinct and her words are far away. Midoriya sees what his mind tells him, looks immediately to find Bakugo, and he finds him. Bakugo is sitting in a seat far across the room. He's listening to someone speak beside him, looking serious and older. He looks as tame as Midoriya has ever seen him, but something feels off. Bakugo looks over at him, and for a moment they lock eyes. Midoriya can hear his heartbeat in his ears. For a long moment they're too loud in his head, too intense, and he's watching Bakugo's face like any little give might be the last blow to a cracking dam. But Bakugo's face doesn't shift. He looks at Midoriya. And looks away. Simple as that. Like he'd never even seen him. Like there was nothing there between them but a broken tether. Midoriya can see them for what they are now. He sees the piles of ash in the miles between them, the remains of a bridge that Bakugo had incinerated years ago. He sees the thread that had held them together. He sees the place where Bakugo had hacked away at it with a knife. He sees it all now, and he knows this is it. His oldest friend was an ocean's reach away now, and he thinks to himself, maybe it's for the best. Bakugo's image is devoured by flame, and Midoriya is plunged back into the dark. Midoriya thought it had been far too long since he'd been home as he stared at the front door of his childhood house. He'd knocked on the door gently, wondering if his mother would be home today or if she'd gone out. He didn't call home enough anymore. He didn't hear from his mother nearly as much as he should. It had become harder as the months wore on. It hadn't been long before phone calls became scarce. Not because his mother stopped caring, and not because he'd stopped caring. Midoriya Inko was no fool, and she knew when her son was leaving out information during their late-night phone calls. She watched the news and sometimes she saw him doing good things, hero things, and she smiled. Sometimes she saw her son there involved in another incident involving the UA, and she did her best not to pry when she called later on at night. Her son was always fine, always happy, when he spoke with her on the phone. He never complained to her about that school, or the hero work, or the danger. He never mentioned any injuries, any aches or pains or hardship, because of course it would only worry her more. Midoriya Izuku was persevering on his own, and Midoriya Inko liked to believe that he would tell her when he was ready. So when Izuku appeared at the doorstep of his childhood home on a random weekday morning, without a call or a text, looking as though he hadn't slept in quite some days, she said nothing of it. Izuku, Mrs. Midoriya smiled warmly at her son. Welcome home. Midoriya smiled with tired eyes. Hi, Mom. Midoriya let himself be fussed over by his mother, ushered into the living room and left to settle in as she put the kettle on. He glanced around the living room, setting himself down lightly onto the couch. Everything was the same as it had been before he left. Nothing changed in any particular way, nothing was dusty or neglected. It was still a well-lived-in home. It was just one person short. Izuku felt a little warm in the safety of his home, in the company of his mother. Like himself, his mother was fond of photographs. The walls beside the TV were dotted with picture frames. Old ones and newer ones. Photos of Izuku as a child, young and ecstatic. Photos of him growing up, more skittish and nervous than before, but still smiling. And photos of him from recently. Of him before UA, some with his classmates, one was of him from the tournament, and another was beside All Might. Midoriya Inko was just as sentimental as her son, and he felt it in his chest how much he'd missed this. He missed being home. He missed this feeling of comfort and safety that the lofty dorms of the academy fell short on. Not to say that he wasn't happy at UE. His room was wonderful and he'd settled in just fine. But there would always be something intrinsically comforting about the home he grew up in. He remembered his conversation with All Might just a few days before, when All Might had requested they eat lunch together. Young Midoriya, All Might said to him, "You don't look well. I assume this is because your nightmares are getting worse." Midoriya nodded. Toshinori looked at him thoughtfully. "Listen, my boy," he spoke softly. "I understand you're under much duress right now, with all that's happening and all that I have entrusted to you. I won't lie to you and say that things are going to get better. But I'll tell you this." All Might gave him a gentle smile. "Go home, Midoriya. Take a day to be with the people you love." He sat back in his seat, gaze drifting to the windows, as though remembering something from long, long ago. To your roots. Remember what it is that you fight for. That's the best thing you can do for yourself now. Midoriya had tried to avoid that course of action. He wished he could be efficient enough that he could manage his burdens and continue his studies unbothered, and never have to trail them back to the woman he had moved away from to protect. He never wanted to bring his struggles back here, to his childhood home, and to his mother most of all. He wanted a safe, easy life for her. He wanted her to rest easy at night, and not worry herself so much over him. But Midoriya couldn't be the hero he needed to be yet. He couldn't continue to grow until he cleared his headspace. So he followed his mentor's advice. He went home. The night before had been the last straw. Don't say things like that. Bakugo Katsuki had said to him after all that had happened. Talk to someone. Tell someone. Don't pretend it isn't bad. It'll only get worse. Midoriya kept seeing Bakugo's face in the grim lighting, kept seeing those sharp, red eyes turn on him without a hint of aggression. It was a version of his childhood friend he was unfamiliar with. But then again, they'd had months and months of minimal contact to grow up and away from each other. Midoriya had stopped chasing Bakugo's back, had stepped onto his own path and away from the path already paved for someone else. Over the months, their relationship had lost most of its venomous tension, but what was left in its wake was nothing substantial. A half-cut thread, a half-forgotten bond. They'd gone from utterly repellent of each other to nothing at all. Midoriya hadn't meant for them to become so estranged. But he'd never meant to separate so far from his mother either. All he'd wanted was to grow stronger, to become someone that others could lean on without worry of him crumbling. He'd wanted to become someone worthy of filling All Might's shoes. "Izuku," his mother cooed softly, "it's so good to see you." She sat beside him on the couch, setting a cup of tea in front of him and setting the other for herself in her lap. "It's great to be home, Mom." He meant it. He picked up the cup and took a sip, feeling the tension begin to ease out of his system. Half guiltily, he looked at his mother. "How have you been?" If she noticed his guilt, she said nothing of it. She only smiled. Good. Nothing much has changed around here. The neighbor's kid, what's his name?" Tobio? Do you remember him? He was still crawling when you last saw him, wasn't he? Well, the other day. Izuku appreciated it. He really did. She didn't ask about the bags under his eyes, or the restless way his right hand trembled when he held his teacup. She didn't ask what he was doing here out of the blue like this. She just kept smiling at him, telling him all about the neighbors and the new plants she bought at the market the other day. She told him about a new recipe she found and how she'd invited Mitsuki Bakugo over to try it with her. Bakugo? Midoriya asked, startled. You invited Bakugo's mother over? She nodded, humming as she took a sip of her tea. Ever since you boys went off to live in the school dorms, we've been spending more time together. She doesn't look at Midoriya as she says this. It's nice talking to her. I didn't think it would be. When she first approached me, I was very apprehensive. After all that's happened between you and Katsuki in the past, I worried. She approached you? Midoriya tried not to remember the way even Bakugo Katsuki had spoke to him last night. Tried not to wonder. If his mom had made amends with Bakugo Mitsuki, was it possible for Kaken and himself to do the same? His mother hummed. After you and your friends brought Katsuki home the day that All Might, well, she came to my door the day they shipped you off to the UA dorms. She told me what Katsuki told her, of everything that had happened to him and how you risked your lives to save him. Midoriya Inko didn't look at him as she smiled her watery smile. She kept her eyes toward her teacup, but kept her voice light. She told me I should be proud. That you turned out to be a good kid, despite all you had to struggle through. Midoriya Inko's voice shook a little, and still she did not look at her son. He could see her eyes shine even as she didn't face him. She apologized for everything that happened between you and Katsuki when you were younger. She said she hoped that being away at school, being near you, would help him to be a better person. Mom. He took the teacup from her hands and set it on the table, grasping her palms to steady the both of them. His mother threw her arms around him. Oh, Izuku! She cried. My poor boy. Izuku hugged his mother tight, smiling his own watery smile into her shoulder. I'm glad you're friends with her, Mom. He squeezed her lightly. Tell her Kaken is getting along just fine without me. They stayed like that for a little while. Midoriya held on to his mother nearly for dear life, feeling something heavy he hadn't even realized was there begin dismantling in his chest. He sent a silent thanks to Toshinori for advising him to go home. It was beginning to feel like the cure to end all illness to Izuku. Eventually, Izuku's mother sat back again and rubbed at her eyes. She put on the classic Midoriya smile after crying, and Izuku smiled back. Tell me more about how you two came to be friends. He requested. She nodded kindly. Well, she came over one morning. Inko laughed to herself. More like, she found where we keep the Heidi key, and let herself in for breakfast. She made coffee and everything by the time I got up. When I asked her what she was doing, she looked so serious. Inko smiled fondly. She told me she didn't like the idea of me being alone all the time. I laughed at her then and didn't think much of it. But you know those Bakugas. Always so full throttle about everything. She made it a point of inviting herself over every other day or so after that. Midoriya knew full well what it was to be the focus of a Bakugo's determination. Never before had he heard such a peaceful outcome of it though. It's odd to think that after all this time, we're still growing up. Inko said with such a note of melancholy that it struck Izuku speechless. He still hadn't found the words as she got to her feet, taking Izuku's cup in her own and disappearing into the kitchen. Midoriya Izuku's nightmares are never quick and painless. They begin with Bakugo Katsuki, yes. It begins with his oldest friendship blowing away like dust in the wind, given up before he can even put up a fight. But that's never where it ends. In the dark, Izuku is whisked away into a dark room. There's a dying light swaying somewhere high up toward the ceiling, glinting off the dark walls, allowing Midoriya to see only his hands in front of him and two figures standing beyond the veil of light and within the world of shadow. There's labored breathing and he can't tell if it's coming from him or someone else. He hears bone-chilling chuckling, soft and low at first, loudening with confidence as the situation begins to unfold more and more clearly to Izuku. The light keeps swaying, The edges of the room become sharper. The two figures before him step forward, and the light washes over them, and Izuku is struck cold with agony, clutched by unbearable fear. Shigaraki, hooded and grinning, has his hand wrapped around Midoriya Inko's throat, four of his fingers pressed to her skin. Inko is wide-eyed, staring at Midoriya like she's never seen him before. She keeps whispering, "I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I'm sorry," like she doesn't even see him. "What's the matter, Midoriya Izuku?" Shigaraki is laughing, eyes bright with victory. "I thought you wanted to be a hero? Didn't you want to be just like All Might?" There are no words in Izuku's mouth, and the screaming in his head is wordless. All he hears is his own desperate, too far gone cries. The panic is a red mist over his sight, a billowing cloud in his thoughts. Shigaraki smiles like he knows, chuckles like it's funny. "A real hero has to know loss, Izuku. You and I both know that," he says. Izuku watches immovably as Shigaraki presses the fifth and final finger to her flesh, and Izuku's mother's throat whittles away to dust. "I'm just giving you what you wanted." He cackles manically, and Midoriya Inko's final scream echoes in Izuku's mind like a gunshot. Everything falls away again, back into darkness. "Izuku," Midoriya's mom said thoughtfully as she re-entered the room. "I'd meant to ask before, but..." "What?" Here was he thought. Here it comes. Of course she'd want to know. Of course she couldn't just sit and pretend her son wasn't cutting school and skipping class. Of course she'd eventually have to ask him what's wrong. Because she couldn't just let her son sit there and look like he hadn't slept in weeks and do nothing about it. "How are you and Katsuki doing?" she asks, and Izuku freezes. "Kaken?" He stutters, tripped up at the total derailment of his thoughts. He sees Bakugo Katsuki's eyes on him last night. He sees that grim face in the low lighting of his bedroom. He sees uncharacteristic concern, and a heaviness that Izuku had only ever imagined he was capable of feeling. He sees a maturity in Bakugo that had never been there before. She nods, handing him a bowl. He looks down, only just realizing she'd brought out some sort of soup for him. "You haven't mentioned him in months to me. I wondered if perhaps you two are doing better." "Doing better?" Midoriya thought. "Well, we aren't exactly doing worse." The radio silence was a step up from the old constant belittling and bullying that Midoriya used to reference with Bakugo. But somehow, it didn't make Midoriya feel much better about whatever lied between them now. But Midoriya didn't want to lie to his mother. Not about this. Not about Bakugo Katsuki. "Nothing," he told her quietly. "There's nothing between us, Mom. I don't think I've so much as talked to him in months." Besides last night. Inko looked at Izuku, quiet for a long moment. Privately, Inko Midoriya knew about the childhood her son had been forced to suffer due to the antics of Bakugo Katsuki. She knew and resented the boy a little because of it. She resented Mitsuki Bakugo a little because of it too, even now. So a part of herself chose to be glad of the fact that her son and Katsuki were separate entities now, divided instead of tied together like they always had been. But Inko Midoriya was also a forgiving woman, and that was the person she chose to be above all else. So when Mitsuki Bakugo came knocking that day, before the hatred she'd always felt for that woman, she chose to forgive her. She chose to welcome her into her home, and they'd been friends ever since. Good friends. Inko had been able to rediscover the kinder side of Mitsuki, the one that was passionate and protective, and not cold and cruel. Inko had been able to consider a potential future where Katsuki and Izuku would be close, like they'd been as children, and maybe even closer still. "How do you feel about that, Izuku?" she asked him patiently. "It's probably for the best," Izuku mumbled nervously, as though he didn't really believe himself. "I mean, I'm not growing up under his thumb anymore. He leaves me alone, and I've got all these great friends now who are kind and supportive, and he doesn't try to stand in my way anymore and Izuku stopped, as though choked by the words about to come out, looking tired and defeated. His mother put her hand on his shoulder, rubbing his back gently. "It's okay, Izu." Through a heavy, exhaled breath, Izuku said, "I don't know how I feel about it." He said, "Sometimes I feel like I miss him, but I don't know why. I mean, there's nothing to miss. He was cruel, and awful, and I was alone all the time because of him. Izuku took a shaky breath, lowering his voice again. But sometimes I think we could be best friends again, if only we tried to talk it out. We could be this amazing team, if only we knew how to close the distance between us. That's true. Inko murmured softly, you two could be one of the strongest hero duos Japan has ever seen. Something tightened in Izuku's chest at hearing the words out loud. But somehow, he felt even more tired than before at the confession. Well, Midoriya, Inko said gently, seeing her son grow even more faded looking. Why don't you go rest up? I'll start cooking dinner. I'll make your favorite. He nodded. Thank you, Mom, he said as he hugged her and left the room. Midoriya Inko made her way into the kitchen alone, murmuring to herself thoughtfully, world's strongest duo, huh? She smiled a little. Mitsuki would be over the moon to hear Izuku agrees. Izuku's nightmares get more and more creative as the months pass on, and the more confrontations he has against the League of Villains. But there are always three constants. The first is always Bakugo Katsuki. The second is always his mother. And the third is always the death of All Might. It's never about the act. His nightmares are cruel, but perhaps even his subconscious knows to draw a line somewhere. It's a small mercy that he never has to see All Might die in his mind. No, it's always about the aftermath. Midoriya drips through the blackness, through the absence of thought, into another scene. This time he's in a cemetery. Rain pouring, sky roaring. Distantly there is screaming sobs of anguish. Midoriya Izuku is standing among the mass of agonized faces, dressed in a suit specifically bought for this day. Dressed to send the great All Might off, to bid him safe passage into the unbearable unknown. Dressed for his funeral. Midoriya Izuku is not crying. He's glancing around face to face. Uraraka and Ida are leaning on each other, wailing together, trying to pull up enough strength between the two of them to get through this. Todoroki is standing stone-faced beside his father, who looks entirely too smug. Kirishima and Kaminari are weeping, and Bakugo Katsuki is nowhere to be seen. Professor Aizawa and Professor Mike are silent, standing beside each other in grim understanding that the worst is only beginning, now that the symbol of peace is gone. Even Gran Torino is here, but there is nothing but stark vacancy to his gaze. No one blames him. He has watched the two closest people to him pass on before him, and God knows there was no comforting him of that. The rain pours. The casket is lowered into the ground. Izuku and a number of other familiar faces toss their flowers into the pit with him. The casket is buried, the people go home, but the wailing trails Izuku back. It follows him to his childhood house, like a ringing in his ears. It doesn't stop. It doesn't stop. The rain still drips on him from inside his house. His suit is drenched, his hair is sopping. The world is wet with tears he cannot cry. The rain washes him into another cemetery. It's smaller, quieter. There's a small group of people here, minuscule compared to the previous crowd. It's still raining, pouring. The world is still shrouded in their grief, but the rain that pours here is gentler. This is not All Might's funeral. This is not a day for the symbol of peace. Gran Torino is here. His face is wet and his eyes are dulled, but there is a grief there that had not been at All Might's funeral. The man from the military police is there too. He's holding an umbrella over his head, ever practical, though he somehow looks just as wet beneath it from the solemnness that's washed over his features. A handful of others, people that Midoriya Izuku has seen before but knew only little about. These people are not big-shot heroes. These people are not the adoring public of All Might. These people are not dissociated. These people are silent in their mourning, and they are rough in their grief, and being here is not a public affair for them, because this is different. This is not All Might's funeral. There is a small tombstone before the pit for the casket. It's just like every other tombstone in the tiny graveyard. It's simple, quaint. There's a name ingrained in its surface that next to no one has ever known before. The name on the tombstone reads, Yagi Tashinori. There are hands on Midoriya Izuku's shoulders. They've been there since the moment of All Might's passing. When Izuku closes his eyes, he knows whose hands they are. He knows why he feels so heavy now, he knows why he has to carry this weight. Yagi Toshinori, the man behind the mighty All Might, has his hands on Midoriya Izuku's shoulders. He's dressed in a suit too, though it's very baggy on his frail frame. He's saying to Midoriya, only to Midoriya, because no one else can see him, because no one else can feel the weight of the symbol of peace but him now. Shoulders back, Midoriya, my boy. Head up. Help me to the casket, won't you? Help me lie down. Stay with me until I go. The casket from All Might's funeral was empty. No one but the select few who knew his secret were aware. But it made it all the more difficult to watch an empty box lower into the ground, because for those that came to watch the real and true burial, that was just a prelude to what would come. Midoriya, my boy, I'm sorry. I'm sorry I cannot guide you any further. The Yagi Toshinori at Midoriya Izuku's back is heavy like All Might, so heavy. Midoriya feels like 1,000,000 tons are resting on him as he steps up to the casket, as 3 others step close too. Together, they heft the box off the platform. Midoriya's face is pale, so pale. His mouth is a flat, trembling line. His eyes are on the closed wooden box in his hands, and they never waver from where they're pinned. I'm sorry, Midoriya. I'm so sorry. Yagi Toshinori doesn't leave Midoriya's side as they lower the casket into the ground. There's something terrible and thick in Midoriya's throat, there's a hot burning behind his eyes, but he can't bring himself to move another muscle. He can't bring himself to take the flower outstretched to him that others are taking and throwing into the ground. He can't will himself to move. Go, Midoriya, my boy. You've got to keep moving. Just a little bit more. Just a little bit more. Midoriya, Gran Torino rasps. Izuku takes the flower. He walks up to the pit after Gran Torino, watches the old man take a deep breath and let the flowers sink into the grave. Go in peace, Toshinori, Gran Torino whispers into the open air, and turns away. Midoriya grips the rose until the pricks break skin, until he can feel pain above the horrible thing floating around in his chest now. He can feel pressure building somewhere in him, and he doesn't know how to release it, doesn't know how to stop it, because his eyes just keep burning hotter and hotter. The breath in his lungs keeps on shortening, the pressure in his lungs just climbs higher and higher, and he doesn't think he has any more room for air. Izuku, Yagi Toshinori, is smiling at him over his shoulder. The hands don't let go of his shoulders. Midoriya almost thinks it's a good thing. If he let go, Izuku might just lose his grip on the earth and disappear. Let go, my boy. Let go. I can't. He gasps, his hands trembling now, pulling the rose back into his chest, feeling the blood trickling down his fingers, down his wrist, mixing with the rain. I can't. The pressure is unbearable. His face is getting so hot. The rain keeps pouring down. Izuku can't breathe. Izuku can't breathe. Izuku can't breathe. I'm sorry, Toshinori says, and he looks apologetic, he really does, but he also looks relieved, somehow. He looks lighter. I'm sorry, my boy. But you must. And so Izuku does. He lets the flower go, watches it drop with the rain and his blood into the casket. He tries to stand back, but his knees give out, and the hands. The heavy hands of All Might are gone, but the weight, the unbearable weight, is still there. And Izuku knows. He knows it will never leave him until the moment he finally goes to greet whatever lies on the other side, whatever exists for him after life. He falls to his knees. Izuku Midoriya falls to his knees. And the world blinks. One moment he's there. The cemetery. The grief and the rain. In the next moment, the city is burning. There's screaming for miles and miles, there's blood trailing in the streets and people are wailing their pain, their grief, someone has died, everyone is dying, the world is burning. All Izuku hears is the collective agony of a world without All Might, a world that he cannot save. Among the rubble are familiar faces. His classmates. His teachers. Uraraka, looking bent and strange and unmoving beneath a pile of rubble, and Kirishima, bloody and half torn apart. There's Ida, but oh God, his legs. Gone. Izuku is blinking, there's blood in his eyes, and he can't feel his legs beneath him where he kneels, and Bakugo is soaping in his own gore, and there's glass sticking from his chest, and from the odd angle he lays, Izuku knows he's fallen from a tall building. No one is left but Izuku. All Might is gone, has been gone for some time, his mind tells him. His mother was one of the first to die shortly after the death of the symbol of peace. It was a show of power, a display of free reign now that the great protector had passed. Izuku is alone, on his knees, the world is burning, he hears this deadly ringing in his ears like he knows he's moments from the end, moments from greeting All Might on the other side and Midoriya. You'll never replace All Might. You'll never even get close. Shigaraki is cackling in his ear, everywhere and nowhere. His goons are lining up Midoriya's friends in the streets, dragging their limp bodies into open space, as if to say, there. As if to tell him, you're no hero. You can't save anyone after all, can you? You'll never be anyone but a useless, quirkless fool. And Shigaraki is laughing, that awful, cruel cackle as he snaps his fingers, and all of his friends, all of the heroes he's ever looked up to, are slaughtered right before his eyes. There's someone knocking on the front door of Midoriya Izuku's childhood home. There's someone knocking on the front door of Midoriya Izuku's childhood home. Inko Midoriya, who was cooking dinner, startled at the sound of the door. She hadn't been expecting anyone today, and she knew Mitsuki would be working at this hour still. Her thoughts flashed quickly toward the notion that perhaps it was someone from the school. She wondered if Izuku had done something that caused him to come home unannounced, and caused someone to trail after him. She banished the thought quickly. Her son was a good kid. She very much doubted that he'd done anything wrong, and if he had, he wouldn't have run away from the consequences. She wished he would come out and tell her why he'd come home so suddenly, but she wouldn't push him for the answer. For all he'd accomplished for himself, he deserved to be treated like an adult. He deserved privacy. So, reassured a bit now, she wiped her hands on a kitchen cloth. Whoever it was at the door, it wouldn't be for Izuku. It must be one of the neighbors, or someone trying to tell her something. She walked out the kitchen and over towards the door. She flipped the lock and pulled the door open. The sun beginning to set low in the sky washed over her eyes, blinding her momentarily. But at the face that greeted her when she adjusted, her eyes widened and her voice went quiet with shock. "Bakugo Katsuki." She addressed the boy. The aforementioned boy stood very still on her doorstep. He was dressed in his school uniform, with his hands shoved in his pockets and his shoulders taking on a very peculiarly timid look. His face, which Inko could only ever remember seeing with a grimace or a sneer on him, was abnormally withdrawn. He looked heavy with what she could only guess was concern. After a long beat, he inclined his head to her, just a little. "Mrs. Midoriya," he said, and there was no gruffness to his words. "Is Dek?" He seemed to bite his tongue for a moment, eyes flashing just a little wider with self-consciousness. He wondered, privately, if calling him Deku to his mother's face would be a horrible offense. He wondered if she would turn him out on the street for the name alone. For the reminder of why her son had always been so terribly sad when they were growing up. No, Katsuki reasoned. Deku was his hero name now. The name that Katsuki had given to him when they were kids was no longer a poison to wield against the green-haired boy. It meant something else to Izuku now, so maybe it could mean something else for Katsuki too. He tried again, a little more sure. "Is Deku here?" Inko Midoriya's face gave away very little. Any old contempt she might still feel for him, and any of the strong respect she had for his mother refused to fall through the cracks. Her expression only remained passive, if a little distant. "Does your mother know you're here?" She asked him softly, so that it didn't come out as accusatory. Bakugo's eyes darted away from hers. "No then," Inko thought, and huffed a small laugh. "Come in then," she told him, turning away from him before he could see the look on her face. "I'll get Izuku." Bakugo Katsuki had never felt more disarmed, never more unprepared, walking into the home of his childhood friend, who had not been his friend for so many years now. He'd come here expecting hostility, expecting to have to fight his way in to see Midoriya. After all that had happened when they were kids, and the awful impression Mrs. Midoriya must have of him because of then, he'd thought it would be more a struggle. He didn't know what to think of the fact that it hadn't been hard at all. Mrs. Midoriya had only laughed at the idea that his mother didn't know he was there. He wondered if she would call the school on him. Mrs. Midoriya set Bakugo in the living room and left him on the couch, disappearing down the hall to get Izuku. Midoriya is laying on his childhood bed when his mother knocks on his bedroom door. He's got one of his old notebooks lying open beside him, charred a little, and the pages are crinkled from being thrown in the river by a certain explosive boy. He's flipping a little mindlessly through it, exhausted but too restless to sleep. He doesn't want to have his mother find him screaming from the nightmares. Somehow he doesn't think even his childhood bed will cure his nightmares. Izuku, his mother near. Whispers from the doorway, face soft with concern. "You have a visitor." Slowly, Izuku pushed himself up into a sitting position. He looked at his mother, trying not to seem anxious. "Who?" he started to say, but trailed off, not knowing if he wanted to hear any names. Could it be someone from the school? Mr. Aizawa, coming to threaten expulsion if he ever tried to cut school again? All Might coming to check in on him? It was still early in the day. He doubted Uraraka or Ida had even gone by his room yet. They wouldn't have come here. They wouldn't have known to come here even if they'd gone to check on him yet. His mother gave him a very gentle look. "I can send him away if you'd like." Him? Midoriya pushed himself off the bed, to his feet. He started towards the living room, trying to get past his mother. Inko pressed a hand to his shoulder to stop him. He froze in place. "Izuku," she said, and her tone was firm. "Sooner or later you are going to have to tell me what all this was about, especially now that whatever it is, it's brought that boy to our home. But for now I won't ask any questions. I'm going out to the supermarket now. Call if you need anything." And then she turned and walked down the hall, and turned before the living room and walked out the front door. She locked the door behind her. Izuku, standing dumbfounded in his own doorway, stumbled a little as he moved to walk into the living room. The afternoon light was spilling into the living room when Izuku walked in, drowning out his sight for a brief moment. He blinked against the gleam, light splashing against the glass of hanging photographs and the black TV screen. Standing in the middle of the room, staring off toward the front door, looking nervous and uneasy, stood Bakugo Katsuki. Izuku couldn't believe his eyes. "Kaken," Izuku said. Bakugo Katsuki flinched at the name, his attention darting to Izuku. Izuku watched him bite his lips, as though he had no idea what to say, how to go from here. "What are you doing here?" Midoriya asked. When he spoke, it wasn't soft. He didn't know how delicate the scene before him was. He didn't know how to take this. They hadn't been on good terms for so many years. The fact that Bakugo was inside his house right now was beyond recognition for Midoriya. There wasn't any familiar way to react. He could only be firm. He could only refuse to be gentle. No matter what Bakugo had come here to say, Midoriya had to be steady. But Bakugo was quiet for a long moment. They only looked at each other, and at first Midoriya didn't see the perpetual quiet that surrounded his childhood friend. Didn't see the slow deliberateness to Bakugo. Like he had cast off any of his usual time bomb crudeness, any of that rough, uncompromising exterior. And stripped of all that bravado, Midoriya found only a strong, steady presence. A boy that had come out of a feeling of sheer instinct, and had nothing to say for it. Everyone was worried. Bakugo said eventually, "When you didn't show up to class today, everyone worried. People went to your room to check on you." Izuku stared. "I was the only one to try the knob." Bakugo said quietly. All the tension that had seemed to hold Midoriya up, keep him standing straight, seemed to drain out of him at that. His shoulders slumped forward, his eyes sliding to the floor, knees bent as though to barely catch himself from falling in. He moved over to the couch and sat himself tentatively down. "So what?" Izuku said quietly, emotionlessly. "Are you going to drag me back?" There was a long stretch of silence. "Drag her?" Katsuki huffed a humorless laugh. "How many years did you dream of becoming a student at UA, and now?" Something tightened in Izuku's chest. No, he wanted to snap. No, that's not it. He shook his head. But more than that, he wanted to snap at Bakugo Katsuki for showing up to the one place he didn't want it all to follow him back. This one boy who had once been his friend, who had once been his enemy, who was now almost nothing at all to him, he wished he hadn't come here. There were too many open wounds, too many raw feelings. Why do you care? Izuku heard himself say, and in anger, a blinding rage like none he'd ever known before surged onto him. You of all people, for you to have come here, when all you've ever done is try to crush me under your boot. What does it matter to you? How could any of this possibly matter to you? Izuku clutched the fabric of his t-shirt, right over his heart. He could feel himself unhinging, he could feel the meltdown as it happened, but his mouth kept running, and the pain kept bearing down on him like nothing before. So what if I have nightmares or if I go home for a day? It shouldn't matter to you. I'm just another footstool to you, aren't I? You should be glad I'm losing it. One less person to have to compete with, right? Deku, go on, tell me how useless I am. Tell me how weak and pathetic I am for running from my problems. That's what you're here for, right? To rip into me about the coward I turned out to be, right? To tell me how All Might's power is wasted on me. The silence flooded in, after the words left Izuku's mouth. You could hear a pin drop in the quiet, but all Izuku heard was the blood rushing in his ears, his heartbeat speeding too fast, too sharp, too much. The burning feeling crawling up his throat, scratching up behind his eyes. It was all too much. It was all too much. Bakugo didn't blink, didn't snarl, or yell, or turn vicious. He looked utterly dismantled, standing there in the fading afternoon light, in Midoriya Izuku's childhood home, a place he had not been for over 10 years. Bakugo had not been his friend in over 10 years. Izuku, he said so quietly, you have to know that's not true. Midoriya just looked so devastated. His expression crumbled at Bakugo's gentle tone, at the face of the boy he had not spoken to on decent terms in almost a decade. The face that haunted him growing up, always taunting him, always trying to break him. Midoriya was so tired. He didn't want to face their divide now, didn't want Bakugo to come breaking in on him now when he could least stand it. Midoriya didn't know if he could stand it if Bakugo did a 180 on him now, and tried to fix everything. Midoriya walked through the halls of school the next morning as he normally did. Dressed in his uniform, listening to the sporadic conversation of students in classrooms before the first bell. He listened to his own footsteps twine into the lively noise of the school, listened to all the people going on with their lives and being happy and striving forward in a world that's fate is always so uncertain. It was an ordinary day. The sun was out and bright, the skies blue and clear. The birds sang from treetops, the students walked to and fro across campus. Nothing had changed. No one had felt the world shift out from underneath his feet in the last 48 hours. Everything had gone on. Midoriya counted his footsteps to the door of All Might's office. He counted the breaths, the seconds, the minutes until he raised his knuckles to the door and knocked 3 times. The door swung open under his hands, as though Yagi Tashinori had been waiting for him. And maybe he had, because the gaunt figure looked searchingly at him through the doorway. Midoriya, my boy, Yagi said gently, still looking for something in Midoriya's face. Come in. Midoriya nodded, and stepped in past the retired symbol of peace. The door clicked shut behind him. You have to know that. Bakugo said again, but firmer this time. He'd stepped into uncharted waters the moment he stepped into Midoriya's room that morning and dug where he had not been welcome in years. He couldn't falter now. Is this about All Might's power? Bakugo asked him, stepping forward. Because there's no one in the world that deserves it more than you, Deku. No one's earned it like you have. Midoriya began shaking his head, still looking worn and angry and wasted, but the more that Bakugo went on the worse he seemed to look. Don't say that, he was whispering, don't say that. It's the truth. Bakugo insisted earnestly. It's not. Midoriya said. It's not. You don't mean it. You can't just say that. We don't talk, Kaken. I haven't spoken to you in months, directly. You can't tell me that your opinion has changed so drastically since we fought that night and All Might explained everything. You can't say that I've earned it. I can say whatever I want. It's a lie. At this, Bakugo seemed to get angry. I'm a lot of things, Deku, but a liar isn't one of them. I've done a lot of shitty things, but I don't lie. They stared at each other for a long, tense moment. Midoriya was clenching his jaw, biting his tongue against words that weren't thought through, uncalculated. All raw feeling and not enough tactic. Bakugo was staring hard at him like there were a million things he wanted to say, things he wanted to bite out, but he made himself swallow them. He made himself think hard on what he wanted to put out into the open air and leave forever in their memories, what he wanted to imprint into Midoriya's mind and leave there. He wanted it to be a good thing. He wanted to be a positive force this time. He wanted to start over with Midoriya here, starting with this moment. Listen, Bakugo said evenly. There's a lot between us that we need to talk about. But that's not why either of us ended up here, is it? This is about you, and I think I'm exactly the person to be here for you right now. Midoriya couldn't bring himself to look directly at Bakugo as he whispered, "Why is that?" "Because you have nothing to gain from lying to me," he said, and it tore something in Midoriya that made it hard to breathe. "Because I think I'm the only one that you trust with everything. I'm the only one that knows about One for All. I'm the only one you felt like you could talk to, that could understand what you're going through." It was true. In a strange and terrible way, all he said was the truth. Neither of them knew why, knew how. Midoriya had plenty of other friends he felt he could trust and rely on. But there was something between Bakugo and Midoriya, still, after all these years, that was completely abstract and unbreakable. There was no one that Midoriya would rather have watching his back, and begrudgingly, Bakugo felt the same. "All right, Kaken," Midoriya said, and he sounded tired. He sounded resigned to the truth. "Let's talk." Bakugo nodded. But his eyes caught on the picture frames on the walls, and the home that Midoriya Izuku had grown up in, and he found he felt caught here. Stuck. Confined. Like he was 12 years old again, in his middle school uniform, and the sight of Midoriya might make him itch for violence. "We should go," Bakugo said suddenly. "Let's go for a walk." So they did. Midoriya grabbed a jacket from his room, and left a note in the kitchen for his mother, and they took off. Midoriya told Bakugo about his first dream when they were in the park by Midoriya's house, walking through the playground they used to go to as kids. The park was empty now that the sun was going down, and it was growing colder and colder out as the days passed. It was just the two of them. High school kids who had outgrown this playground, who had outgrown their pasts. Midoriya stared at the playground and remembered, conflictingly, all the times he'd been here and Bakugo had beat him to a pulp. They hadn't said much since leaving Midoriya's house. There was just too much to say. No good place to start. There was no way to ease into any of the subjects they were about to speak about in open air. No way to be careful. So Midoriya jumped in, as they stood there watching the empty swing set sway in the breeze. "My nightmares are about 3 things," he told Bakugo. Bakugo said nothing. Just stared ahead at the swing set, like he was remembering, too, what it was like when they were young and Bakugo had tried so hard to destroy Midoriya's spirit. "The first nightmare," Midoriya told him, and he took a steadying breath before he could continue, "is about you." Bakugo tried not to show his surprise. Outwardly, his eyes widened a fraction, but he otherwise displayed no signs of shock. He kept himself still as Midoriya went on. He steeled himself to the outcome. In his mind's eye, he saw flashes of Midoriya's sobbing, agonized face from the other night. He wondered how he'd contributed to that face. He'd wondered how he'd helped to break Midoriya Izuku. "When it starts, we're just kids. You're looking at me and I think I've just taken a beating from you. Or I'm about to. The way you look at me spells pain." Midoriya's face is shut as he speaks, his eyes watching unseeingly toward the swings that are creaking quietly just a few feet away from them. Bakugo feels cold, feels unsteady. He feels like cold water is washing over him, and it just keeps getting colder and colder. He knows he's going to have to face some hard truths tonight, but he was not ready for it to come so soon. "I am Midoriya Izuku's nightmare," he thinks, and it causes a small, incurable tremor to start in his chest, and it rumbles outward to his fingertips. "Then you're 15 and I'm still just a kid. You're in your hero suit, and the way you look at me spells death." Bakugo is clenching his hands in his coat pockets, feeling fragile and bent up in all the wrong ways. But he keeps his gaze fixed on the swing set. He keeps his head in that moment, there with Izuku. He reminds himself of the picture frame that Izuku still keeps in his room of them when they were kids. He reminds himself of the promise he made to Izuku, that he would be here, that he could be steadfast when Izuku could no longer stand on his own. Bakugo Katsuki is no stranger to pain, but this is a sort of pain so different from any he's ever experienced before. I think, Midoriya says slowly, like he knows it'll hurt the both of them to hear aloud, that you kill me. Or you try to, it seems. The words splash like acid across Bakugo's skin, but Midoriya is moving on fast enough that he knows they're not meant to linger here. The next thing I know, I'm in class. I think I've just woken up, but when I sit up, everyone is blurry and everyone is speaking around me, but I can't hear anything anyone is saying. The only clear face in the room is yours. Midoriya turns away at this. He starts walking again, walking toward the slides and the jungle bars. Bakugo takes his cue and follows silently, watching the mop of wild greenish curls as he goes. We're older, maybe, than we are now. But someone is talking to you, and then you look at me and I feel like I'm waiting for something to happen that never does. Because you look away like you hadn't seen me at all, and then suddenly you're a million miles away and I think that's it. That's all we amount to. Nothing but a memory, and I watch you burn up as the world goes black. Midoriya's tone tells him that his first dream ends there. But it feels like enough. It feels like it can only get tremendously, irreparably worse. It feels like Bakugo threw himself into a minefield of mental trauma, and he's no longer sure which way is up. But they're in this together now. There's no going back. What? He breathes as they take a seat at a nearby bench. Does that mean? Midoriya's smile is grim. I think it means that I'm afraid to lose you. He confesses that after all these years, and after all we've suffered together or all we've suffered because of one another, I'm afraid that it'll all amount to nothing. Bakugo leans his head back against nothing, back pressed into the bench. He sighs heavily, and Midoriya resonates with the sound. Christ, Deku. He sighs. Midoriya snorts bitterly. Yeah. Midoriya looked over at Bakugo, who seemed to be searching for something to say. He seemed to be caught up in trying to pull words together, to fix whatever damage he'd wrought in all the years they'd known each other. Midoriya smiled. You don't need to say anything now. He told Bakugo. It says enough that you came here today to find me. Because tonight was not the night to discuss all their failures and falling outs. Tonight was not the night for apologies and explanations. Tonight was about Midoriya. It was about understanding. It was about Bakugo and Midoriya meeting again, tonight, as though they'd never met before. All right, Bakugo said. Let's move on then. Midoriya hummed his approval, and together they got to their feet. They walked through the playground and out the gate, watching the sun dipping below the surrounding buildings. They walked on. Under the bridge, where Midoriya Izuku was first saved by All Might, Midoriya told Bakugo about the second dream. I'm in a dark room, he says, and there's something treacherously solemn about the way his voice changes, the way the shadows under his eyes seem to darken, deepen, bleed down his cheeks. I'm not alone. The trembling in Bakugo's hands has gone away now. The weight of Midoriya's first dream has set into his skin, entered his bloodstream, flowed through his heart. He knows Midoriya's first fear now. He knows he is one cause of his childhood friend's weakness. He knows he won't let himself be a weakness any longer. Beyond the light, I can see two people. Shigaraki Tamura. Bakugo's eyes slant toward Midoriya, apprehensive immediately, and my mother. The tunnel where they're walking slowly is dark and damp, and Midoriya is running his fingers along the wall as though to steady himself. Shigaraki's fingers are wrapped around my mother's throat, all but one finger pressed against her pulse. My mother keeps whispering, I'm sorry, I'm sorry, I'm sorry. It's like she doesn't even see me. But I can't speak. I can't move. Bakugo is seeing it all in his head, painting the awful image as Midoriya describes it. Bakugo keeps seeing his mother in Midoriya Inko's place. Keeps picturing his own mother on the brink of death, whispering his name, whispering apologies to no one at all. His hands are clenched fists in his pockets. He's laughing at me. Midoriya whispers in a rush. He keeps asking me, isn't this what you wanted? Didn't you want to be just like All Might? No, Bakugo thinks, no, not like that. And I can't do anything, I can't even scream, or speak, or beg. Christ, it's just this haze of desperate panic. And I watch, the words seem to catch in Midoriya's throat, and his fingers clench against the wall, and Bakugo watches him shudder with the awful weight of his own imagination. I watch him put all 5 fingers on her throat, and I hear her scream, and her throat turns to dust. And Shigaraki, he tells me that he's just giving me what I wanted. The silence is all static when Midoriya stops speaking. Their breaths are loud under the bridge, in the tunnel. Outside, the street lights are flickering to life and there aren't any cars passing through the streets. It's just Bakugo and Midoriya, just 2 boys, just 2 hellbound, hell-suffering students. All they'd ever wanted in life was to be heroes, was to do some good in this god-awful, upside-down world. But Bakugo sees where it all goes wrong more than a few times. Bakugo sees how his childhood friend could be swayed into fear, seeing all the things he has to lose and how terribly easy it is to lose them. Bakugo starts, and he feels that same tremor in his chest again, like a rattling in his ribcage, like an ache that can't be quelled by telling the truth of what happened over and over again like they've told him that he should. Confessions don't ease pain. Nothing does, really. Nothing but time makes things fade. I think about him all the time. Shigaraki Tamura. Bakugo confesses in a gruff, honest, threadbare voice. What it was like when they pulled me out of the training camp, when they tied me up and sat me in front of all their FNG henchmen and Bakugo released a shaky, frustrated breath. I remember it every night. They stopped walking just outside the tunnel. Bakugo's head was tipped back, staring unseeingly toward the darkening sky. Midoriya tried not to, but he ended up staring at his childhood friend, feeling emotionally raw from all his own turmoil and then shocked at the confession he was being presented with. Felt strange. That they were going blow for blow here. That Midoriya had been giving up all these pieces of himself, all these fears, and he was asking nothing in return for them. But Bakugo was paying him back for these admissions. So they were even. So they were equal. It was nerve-wracking in the moment that it happened. I didn't know if I'd make it out alive. I didn't know if I'd make it home in one piece. But at least, as it happened, it was all going so fast I didn't have much time to be scared. Bakugo said, but I came home, and the first night I spent back in my own bed it killed me. I couldn't sleep for shit. Everything I'd gone through really fell in on me, and I kept seeing those FNG ugly mugs. I kept seeing that all for one guy and Shigaraki, and I remember feeling like I was going to get All Might killed. The muscles in his throat worked. Midoriya could see the tense lines of his shoulders, the unsteady rhythm of his breath. I didn't get it. Still don't get it. Why all these things kept kicking back to me days and weeks after they happened. It's awful. Do you still have them? Midoriya asked quietly. Those dreams, I mean? Bakugo only shrugged, lowering his head but still not looking at his childhood friend. Sometimes. Not as often anymore. Does anything help? Bakugo looked at him, this time. I don't know. He admitted quietly. It's hard to tell if anything really works. You can tell people about it until you're blue in the face and everyone's sick of hearing it, but I don't think it helps. Or you can just keep going forward. Keep training. Keep remembering. Convince yourself you'll be ready the next time they come. No, there's no way to fix it. There's no shortcuts or homemade remedies. Just plain old pain and suffering, and the only way to get past it is to feel it through. Midoriya understands, somehow, what he's really trying to say. And by God he doesn't know why it helps, but it does. It does, because it comes from the strongest person he knows. Because they're in this together, as they have been from the very beginning, whether they knew it all along or not. Let's move on, Deku. Bakugo says, looking back at him. He nods to the road ahead, signaling that it's time to go forward. It's still too early to go back. So they keep moving. Okay, Kaken. They go on. It was at the scene of the sludge villain incident that Midoriya Izuku tells Bakugo Katsuki about his third dream. He starts out slow, tentative. There's no easy way to broach the subject. There's no way to tell him what will inevitably break Midoriya entirely. You know, Midoriya says in a light voice, All Might is the closest thing I've ever had to a father? I've known him for almost a year now, and I know it's not much, but he really is like a dad to me. Bakugo is looking at him out of the corner of his eye as they walk, because he's not really sure where he's going with that or what to say in response. He's given me so much. Midoriya says softly, and there's a gleam in his eyes that drips with adoration and admiration. But there is also sadness there, hanging back. He gave me the life I'd always dreamed of. He gave me power and a family, and a chance to be great, to be the best. And he cares about me and supports me more than my real father ever has. I know this, Bakugo thinks. I know this, so why are you telling me this now? They walk a little farther in a weighty silence. Midoriya is glassy-eyed and Bakugo is wired with dreaded anticipation for what he already knows is coming. My third dream, Midoriya says at last, is the death of All Might. Rain pouring, sky roaring. Distantly there are screaming sobs of anguish. Midoriya Izuku is standing among the mass of agonized faces, dressed in a suit specifically bought for this day. Dressed to send the great All Might off, to bid him safe passage into the unbearable unknown. Midoriya breathes evenly. The funeral is just as you'd expect for the symbol of peace. It's raining. Every hero known to man is there, giving speeches, recounting their experiences of fighting side by side with the #1 hero, and most of his students are there. Uraraka and Ida are a mess, and Todoroki is standing beside his father, and Kirishima and Kaminari are sobbing. Aizawa and Professor Mike are there, and so is Gran Torino. We listen to the eulogies, and lower the casket into the ground, and throw flowers into the grave pit. Midoriya says, like he's recalling a distant memory that still haunts him. I'm not crying. I don't cry. There's an interlude of silence that Bakugo doesn't know how to take. Midoriya is biting his lip, staring down the city blocks that he once ran through to face off with the sludge monster when he was younger and dumber and quirkless. There's more. There has to be more. Why? He asks, despite every warning sign that he shouldn't be so insensitive about the dream, about what haunts Midoriya at night. He needs to know the significance of it. He needs to know why the crybaby that Midoriya had always been doesn't cry at All Might's funeral. Why weren't you crying? It occurs to Bakugo all at once that Midoriya doesn't look like he's breathing. Because Midoriya's voice trembles, and when he looks at Bakugo, it seems as though every inch of him is trembling too under the weight of his own dreams. Because All Might's casket was empty. Midoriya bites out. Yagi Tashinori's was not. It made it all the more difficult to watch an empty box lower into the ground, because for those that came to watch the real and true burial, that was just a prelude to what would come. In my dreams, I slip into another cemetery somewhere else, and it's still raining, and there are only a few people there, then, and I feel so goddamn heavy. Gran Torino is there, and so is the police chief, and the tombstone god. The tombstone marks the gravesite of Yagi Tashinori, the man behind All Might. The real man, who gave his entire life into being a hero. Midoriya's mouth is a weak, grim line. All detriment and sadness. All tremor and not enough stability. I can feel All Might there with me. I feel all his weight on my shoulders, all around me, and I can barely walk. But he tells me to help him to the grave, into the coffin, and under the ground. But I can't. His words are unraveling at this point. His teeth are biting down into his lower lip, and his hands are clenched into fists at his sides, and Bakugo can tell. He can tell this is the finishing blow to Midoriya's calm. This is the real horror he faces at night. Shoulders back, Midoriya, my boy. Head up. Help me to the casket, won't you? Help me lie down. Stay with me until I go. We lower him into the ground. Midoriya rasps. I can't take the flower from Gran Torino. Go, Midoriya, my boy. You've got to keep moving. Just a little bit more. Just a little bit more. I can't drop the flower into the ground. I can't let him go. Izuku, let go, my boy. Let go. He tells me, there are tears streaming down Midoriya's face now. They are not waterfalls of meaningless feelings. These tears are slow and they feel heavy and true on his face. Bakugo can't remember a time Midoriya looked so devastated. Not even the day he found out he was quirkless. Not even when Bakugo used to beat him bloody. Never, never, has he seen his childhood friend look so wasted by anguish. He tells me he's sorry. Midoriya sobs. And I know he means it, but he looks so peaceful. He looks so ready to go that I let the flower drop into the grave, and I let Toshinori go on it. The heavy hands of All Might are gone, but the weight, the unbearable weight is still there. Midoriya clutches his hands in his jacket, hands gripping desperately onto the front of his clothes, and the look in his eyes is severe and hysterical, and Bakugo thinks that's the end, thinks it can't get worse, thinks the suffering has to end somewhere, but... And then I'm on my knees and the city is burning. There's a hysterical note to Midoriya's voice, all desperate gasps and not enough air and too much ache. Bakugo is too shocked, too stunned, to do anything but stare and listen. The League of Villains and so much death and blood, and I watch everyone die around me, and Uraraka and Ida and Kirishima dash. Midoriya's voice kept rising in pitch, caught between panicked gasps and not enough air. Note no Hernatanugar. Dead. They're all and you, note enough or no. And they drag all the bodies, gasp, out into the open and... Possessed. Utterly, completely possessed by blind worry and concern and desperation to get him to stop seeing it all, to stop saying these things. Bakugo grabbed Midoriya and pulled him into his chest, pulled them flush to each other, so that Midoriya's head was pressed into Bakugo's chest and Bakugo's face was pressed into Midoriya's wild green curls. Bakugo's hands are white-knuckled fists clenched in Midoriya's clothes, and he's not letting go. He didn't think as he moved and encompassed the shorter boy. He didn't think, just held him tight to him, pulled him in, wouldn't let him go. And Midoriya broke. All gasping breaths, and finally breathing right again as he cried and cried and cried. I watched them kill you all, Kaken. He sobbed. I watched them slit all your throats, whether any of you were alive or dead, and I couldn't stop them. I couldn't stop them. Bakugo pulled them into an alcove between buildings, and let Midoriya cry for as long as he needed to. He just held his childhood friend, and held him for as long as he dared. He had promised to be there for him through it all. But this was when, at long last, Bakugo Katsuki felt there would never be a moment ever again that he could be totally separate from Midoriya Izuku. An hour later, the two young heroes found themselves in a nearby coffee shop. The temperature outside had steadily declined since the sunset, so they took shelter indoors because Midoriya needed a place to clean up his appearance and also for them to try to get warm. Midoriya left Bakugo standing at the door while he took off toward the bathroom. He was the only one in the shop, besides the one woman behind the counter and Midoriya. The woman kept looking at him strangely, and the clock on the other side of the shop ticked obnoxiously on the wall. Bakugo was still thoroughly shaken by all the things Midoriya had told him today. It wasn't as though he'd never had nightmares before. Sure, Bakugo had had nightmares where his family was taken hostage or used against him. But they were always brief, and he was always able to snap himself from them before they got too real and too graphic. And Bakugo still dreamt about his own abduction. Yes, it terrified him. And yes, it SCGD that it kept coming back to him in such a BSTRD of a way even after so many months. But Midoriya was wrecked by these dreams. And Bakugo understood now why that was. 15-year-olds should not be this familiar with death. Hey, the woman says suddenly, and it snaps Bakugo from his thoughts. Are you gonna order anything? Bakugo nods quietly and steps up to the counter. He's tired. He realizes now that he has a moment in quiet to himself. He should probably get himself something to hold him over until he gets back to the dorms. But the woman seemed to see he was a little lost as he looks up at the menu. You drink coffee? She asks. He shrugs. Sometimes. How do you like it? Black. What about your friend? Does he drink coffee? I dunno. Probably too bitter for him. The woman nods contemplatively. Tell you what, she says. I recognize you both from the UA Sports Festival. Your drinks are on the house, but only if I can make you what I think you'll like. Bakugo didn't think there was much to lose in this case. All right, he said. Try me. She took only a minute. Two drinks were set on the counter in front of Bakugo, and she wore a smile that suggested she loved guessing games. She pushed one of them toward him. "This one's yours." He figured. One of them had whipped cream, and the other one she pushed toward him. He tried a sip, and it was bitter as death. "Not bad," he told her. Midoriya had come back from the bathroom at this point. "What's not bad?" The girl flashed him an eager smile. "Try this one." She pushed the one with whipped cream on top toward Midoriya. He sipped it, and after a curious moment of Bakugo and the barista lady staring at him intensely, he smiled and nodded. "It's good," he said. "Sweet." Bakugo, bewilderingly, felt the small bit of satisfaction at knowing his childhood friend's drink preference. The barista, however, was grinning unabashedly. "I'm glad you like it," she chirped. Midoriya tried to offer money for his drink, but she declined. He tipped her instead, and they walked toward one of the tables in the corner of the room out of earshot. They sit down at the far table, sitting across from each other. Bakugo looks Midoriya hard in the face, inspecting the sore red of his eyes and the tired look that had settled across his expression. He gave Bakugo a slow, weak smile anyway. "You all right?" Bakugo asked him. Midoriya's tired smile remained. "Yeah," he said, and his eyes glanced briefly over Bakugo's face, as though searching for something. "Yeah, I'm all right. Are you?" Bakugo nodded. "Don't worry about me, idiot. I'm not the one who was just crying my eyes out." Midoriya snorted. "So crude, Kaken." They looked at each other for another moment. Midoriya looked better, at least. Less jittery and tense, as though voicing his terrors and coming to face them in the daylight had made it less real, more dreamlike than impending reality. "No, but really, how are you feeling?" Acting as emotional support for someone else can sometimes inflict unintentional emotional and physical distress if you're not careful. Bakugo snored at that. "Are you effing lecturing me on shit like this when you don't even follow your own advice? What do you? Everyone says you're up all night wandering the halls." Bakugo says as he takes another swig of his drink. "So effing bitter. It was great. What is it you're trying to do, Deku? Be a therapist? Or a hero?" Midoriya's face flushed. Embarrassment, shame. Bakugo couldn't tell. Midoriya ran a hand through his wild green-tinted curls, looking anywhere but at Bakugo. "Listen, shithead," Bakugo said, but it lacked any bite. "You've got a lot of raw power and it's gotten you lucky this far. But you're not getting any better than this if you don't start taking care of yourself. Sometimes you have to put yourself first. Maybe that's not a very heroic thing to say, but it's the truth. How do you expect to square off with that handsy fucker when you spent all night listening to one of our sissy classmates talking about how they miss their dog Toto?" Bakugo had this intense look in his eye, like he was put to solving an equation. Like he'd sorted out all the variables and all he had to do was align them and the answer was there. After all that Midoriya had said, and all the time it had taken those words to sink in, this was the product. This was the result. But when he looked at Midoriya could tell they weren't middle school kids anymore who played cat and mouse in the schoolyard. They weren't enemies, or even rivals really. They were allies, friends, partners. They were on the same side, fighting the same fight. It didn't help any of them if one of their strongest fighters was losing a mental battle. And it wasn't just about the League of Villains, or All Might, or being heroes. This was about two boys who had seen hell and suffered already more than they should. This was about fixing up a wound that had been bleeding out for years and years. Bakugo didn't want to fight Midoriya anymore. The boy he'd been measuring himself to for years and years was suddenly shying back, stepping down, falling through the cracks under pressure. There were plenty of reasons to become a hero with or without Deku, but it somehow didn't seem as thrilling of a competition without the apprentice of All Might himself to rival his strength. Without the boy he'd started down this path with in the first place. "I know you're scared about what'll happen in the future, and you'll probably never not be scared ever again. Even amazing heroes like All Might will always find a villain that can kill them, and even if they don't ever find that villain, they all die someday. We all die someday," Bakugo said, and he was firm and steely-eyed as he said it. "There's no helping it. All you can do is get stronger and stronger, Try your best to be better than every villain you ever come across. You'll never be able to save everyone, Deku. Not even All Might could do that. At the end of the day, you have to believe that you've done all you could. All you can do, Bakugo said as he stared Midoriya hard in the eye, looked him down to his soul and spoke the words, is trust us. The two boys finally get back to the dorms at midnight that night. They're both exhausted, worn to the bone. It had been a long day after all. Midoriya can't wait to get into bed. He thinks that maybe he's tired enough that having nightmares isn't possible tonight. Bakugo hopes that all this will have made some difference, no matter how small. When they walk into the dorms, into the common room, the two boys pause before they take off in their separate directions. Katsuki's eyes are subtly wide, as though the thought has just struck him that the moment they walk away, everything may go back to how it was. In the morning, they may see each other again and this will all have been a strange dream. Katsuki will have run out of time to make his amends and begin his apologies. That Midoriya must have thought something similar, because he stepped forward at that moment too. And then he stopped, both of them startled at their own boldness. There was a long moment of silence, of just them and the shadows on the walls. Will things be different in the morning, Kaken? Midoriya asks the question that Bakugo had been thinking, feeling, but couldn't bring himself to speak aloud. They look at each other. Katsuki tries to imagine what it would be like to be Midoriya, Izuku's friend. They'd done it once before, years and years ago. They were very different people then. Midoriya has his own friends now, people he trusts and knows, and he's probably told them a thing or two about the person that Katsuki has been in the past. He wonders if he could possibly fit in Midoriya's world now. He wonders if there's room. But if they were friends, how would it go? Would they talk a lot? Study together? Go out to eat sometimes? Or stay up late talking? Could Bakugo ever look at Midoriya and not think of the things he'd done, or the way Midoriya had once made him feel? Looking at Midoriya now, though, with his same wild green curls and freckled cheeks, he thought he could. His eyes were bright even in the dark, even after today, after all they'd been through. With his scarred hands and brilliant mind and kind heart, Katsuki thought he could. He knew they would be all right if they tried. Yeah. Katsuki says quietly, I think things will be different. Katsuki crosses the space, the few feet of timid distance between them. Midoriya is looking at him with uncertainty, like he can't tell if the difference will be a good or bad thing. Katsuki ruffles Midoriya's hair and looks at him with an expression Midoriya thinks he's never seen before. He looks fun. Midoriya smiles as Bakugo turns and begins to walk toward his room, his hand running through his own messy hair. Get to sleep, nerd. Bakugo calls as he goes, and then disappears down the dark hallway. Yeah, Midoriya thinks. Tomorrow will be different. Midoriya walked through the halls of school the next morning as he normally did. Dressed in his uniform, listening to the sporadic conversation of students in classrooms before the first bell. He listened to his own footsteps twine into the lively noise of the school, listened to all the people going on with their lives and being happy and striving forward in a world that's fate is always so uncertain. It was an ordinary day. The sun was out and bright, the skies blue and clear. The birds sang from treetops, the students walked to and fro across campus. Nothing had changed. No one had felt the world shift out from underneath his feet in the last 48 hours. Everything had gone on. Midoriya counted his footsteps to the door of All Might's office. He counted the breaths, the seconds, the minutes until he raised his knuckles to the door and knocked 3 times. The door swung open under his hands, as though Yagi Tashinori had been waiting for him. And maybe he had, because the gaunt figure looked searchingly at him through the doorway. Midoriya, my boy, Yagi said gently, still looking for something in Midoriya's face. Come in. Midoriya nodded, and stepped in past the retired symbol of peace. The door clicked shut behind him. All Might's office was as it usually was. Blank walls, plain couches, an empty desk. The morning light spilled through the closed blinds and dimly lit the room. Midoriya sat himself on one of the couches, and All Might sat down on the other. They sat like that for a moment. How are you feeling, Midoriya, my boy? I'm fine. Midoriya said on impulse. Somehow the room felt jittery with their nerves, with the weight of a conversation neither of them liked to be having. Midoriya wanted nothing more than to be the perfect apprentice, to not crack under the pressure this early in the game. Yagi Toshinori wanted nothing more than for his apprentice to be okay, to not have to shoulder a burden that he should have handled before his time as the symbol of peace ended. Toshinori sat forward, and the tension was broken. "Do you feel better now that you've gone home?" he asked, and he was relieved to hear his apprehension had not bled into his voice. Midoriya kind of smiled. He looked at his mentor, and Toshinori dared to think he saw a kind of renewed peace and motivation shining in his pupil's eyes. "Yeah," he said. "I think I'm doing better now." Toshinori didn't know what it meant when he said he was doing better. He didn't know what it would mean about how Midoriya would take care of himself from then on. He didn't know what this would entail for the future. But he trusted Midoriya Izuku. So he smiled, grand and proud. "That's my boy," he said gallantly. Izuku grinned, an adorable mix of embarrassed and proud. The two of them got to their feet as the warning bell for class sounded, and started toward the door. Midoriya reached for the door handle, already ready to face his peers, already waiting to see them eye to eye and show them how he was better, how they could rely on him again. He was ready to continue to be steadfast and dependable for the people he cared for most again. But Toshinori pulled Midoriya into a bear hug before his hand touched the handle. It took Midoriya only a moment to process what was happening before he wrapped his arms around his mentor, too. And even as silence fell in the room, even as the sound of students filtering through the halls tapered out and classroom doors slid shut and lessons began, the retired symbol of peace held his pupil, like a father would hold his son, and Midoriya felt his eyes burn with a great and tumultuous grief for the future and love for the present. Midoriya would remember that moment forever. "I'm so proud of you, my boy," Toshinori whispered into the quiet room. He let himself feel, for just that moment, what it was to have a father that was there for him, that loved and supported him. He let it ground him. When they pulled away from each other, Midoriya was not ashamed of the tears that had spilled from the corners of his eyes. This man was as close to a father as he would ever have. And silently to himself, he vowed he would make every second count that he had Yagi Toshinori to guide him, to support him, to stand by him. "Thank you, All Might. I won't let you down." When Midoriya Izuku walked into his first PRD class, everyone's eyes snapped onto him. Conversations died on the lips of his peers. Giddy smiles faded away. Everyone's rapt attention was on him. Midoriya walked down his row and caught eyes with Bakugo. The blonde-haired boy was leaning back in his seat, fingers laced behind his head. The expression on his face was uncharacteristically soft when they looked at each other. Bakugo nodded to him. Midoriya smiled. "Good morning." Someone on the other side of the room gave an audible sigh of relief. Pensive faces melted into easy smiles. Small bouts of conversation kicked up again. It was as though the balance had been restored. Uraraka and Kirishima were both over at his desk in an instant. "What happened to you yesterday?" Uraraka demanded. "And where'd you go off to?" Kirishima asked Bakugo. Bakugo closed his eyes, his expression neutral. It looked like Bakugo wasn't going to be offering him any help here. "I took a day off," Midoriya told them assuredly. "It's no big deal. I was advised to touch base with what made me want to be a hero in the first place." Kirishima's curious eyes slid over to where Bakugo was still lounging, something in his eyes widening like he'd just figured it all out. "Bakugo," he said to Midoriya. "Bakugo made you want to be a hero, huh?" Bakugo cracked an eye at that. Midoriya laughed lightheartedly. "I guess that's partly true," he told Kirishima. "I definitely idolized him when we were kids. But what are you looking at me like that for?" Kirishima was beaming. Uraraka was smiling fondly at him. Midoriya couldn't figure out why, couldn't remember saying anything that would have led to such a positive reaction. Bakugo had both eyes open now, and was lowering his hands as he turned around in his seat. He glanced between Uraraka and Kirishima, squinting at them as though he couldn't grasp where all this strangeness was coming from. "Deku," Uraraka said sentimentally, "I'm so glad you and Bakugo were able to patch things up yesterday." Kirishima, too, appeared overwhelmed by emotion. "Baku bro, I'm proud of you." Making amends with Midoriya is about the bravest thing I've ever seen from you. Midoriya looked at Bakugo, hoping he would look as shocked as Midoriya felt. But Bakugo was scratching the back of his neck, eyes pinned to something across the room on the blackboard. "Shut up, Kirishima," Bakugo said, but it lacked any bite. Midoriya had to smile. It was impossible not to. At lunch, Todoroki and Midoriya were walking toward the lunch tables with their trays of food. Todoroki was mentioning something to him about the lessons he'd missed the day before, and Midoriya was trying to pin it all to memory so he had some oversight of what notes he missed. "Deku!" A voice broke into their conversation. Bakugo was standing behind them, a lunch tray in his hands. He didn't look apologetic for interrupting them, but he didn't look aggressive. He nodded toward the double doors leading out of the cafeteria. Midoriya looked at Todoroki, about to apologize, but Todoroki was shaking, his head with a small smile on his face. "Just," Todoroki said exasperatedly, "text me later. You still have to tell me what yesterday was about." Midoriya had as much tact to look embarrassed, but nodded faithfully. "Thanks, Todoroki." Midoriya took off out of the lunchroom with Bakugo, ignoring Kirishima's big thumbs up he was waving at them and Uraraka's blinding smile. Bakugo led them up to the roof of the building. It was a bright, sunny day. All endless blue sky, and birds chirping from the treetops below them. There was a bench right by the fenced-in edge of the roof. They took their seats there, set their things down and dug into their lunches. They didn't talk for a while. And that was fine. The thing about friendship is that when it's good and solid, words aren't always needed. Just the fact that they were there together, on the edge of the roof after so many years of struggle and strife, that's what made it okay. Even though there was still so much they needed to talk about and apologies to be made, they were there. "How are you feeling, Deku?" Bakugo asked, quiet enough that he easily could have said nothing at all. The words could have been swept up and away by the wind, and neither of them would have known. It was still so strange to Midoriya. He didn't think he'd ever heard Bakugo ask anyone how they were. But things were wildly different between them after yesterday. Something in their relationship had shifted. Some fundamental piece of their dynamic had mutated. Midoriya didn't know where that left them. But if Bakugo was willingly putting his best foot forward, and putting himself out there in a way Midoriya had never witnessed, then Midoriya was more than willing to reciprocate. "I'm good," Midoriya replied. "No nightmares last night." "Well, that could have been because you were overtired." Bakugo told him. "You're right," Midoriya conceded. "But I have a good feeling the next time I have those nightmares, I think I'll be able to talk myself out of them." Yesterday had pulled a lot of strong feelings out of Midoriya. It was possible that he could summon those memories during any nightmare, to remind himself that it wasn't real, that it was all convoluted illusions and grim thoughts. Bakugo nodded at that. There was a short, tense silence. As things were, there were definitely some frayed subjects that they couldn't broach just yet. There were parts of each other that couldn't mesh, that just repelled from instinct alone after all these years. Midoriya felt it in himself, even in that peaceful moment, the idea that in a moment things might switch back to how they used to be. That one wrong word, one uncalculated step, would send them spiraling back to the beginning. He thought he saw it in Bakugo too. He wasn't as quick to speak his mind, the way they were at that moment. "Listen," Midoriya started, clearing his throat. He had to admit he was nervous about asking, but it had to be done. Someone had to start or they would. "Stay in place. I know you like to train alone, Kaken, but I have this idea for a combination move." Bakugo's eyes snapped to his. "What?" There was the instantaneous, thought-to-tongue reaction that Midoriya was looking for. "When did you come up with this?" Midoriya had trouble not smiling. "Back when we fought All Might." Bakugo snorted. "Of course you would." Midoriya couldn't help himself. "Stop your fucking beaming and tell me the combination move, the minute." So, Midoriya started, launching into the detailed explanation of the move and the dynamics involved. Bakugo listened quietly for the most part, cutting him off only when Midoriya's thorough planning developed a small error or miscalculation. Bakugo wasn't exactly rude with his corrections, more like firm. Because, to Bakugo, his respect for Midoriya had finally sunk into him. had finally solidified and stuck, and he'd accepted it. Whether he would ever say it out loud or not, he knew that Midoriya would someday be a top-ranking hero based on intellect and sheer strategic aptitude alone. Some nights, after that day that Bakugo and Midoriya had solidified their friendship, the two boys could be found at the gym together. If ever anyone was looking for one or the other, they would no doubt be found together. In the gym, sprawled across the mats, throwing punches or trading workout tips. In the beginning, no one really knew how to comprehend the two smartest and most volatile boys in class being so close together so suddenly. It was like a backlash. After so many years in conflict with each other, they suddenly clung inseparably to one another. It was certainly a spectacle when one night Uraraka and Tsuyu walked into the gym to find Bakugo spotting Midoriya as he did squats while lifting 300 pounds over his head. Or the time Kirishima had walked into the gym to find Bakugo standing alone in the middle of the mats. "Yo!" Kirishima called, curious as to why Bakugo was just standing there, staring up at the ceiling by himself. Bakugo glanced at him out of the corner of his eye, but didn't completely take his eyes off the ceiling. "Hey!" Suddenly, Midoriya fell from the ceiling. His eyes were closed and his body fell limply through the air. Kirishima's blood went cold immediately, body starting forward to try and catch him before he could slam into the matted floors. But Bakugo was already there, leaping off the floor and meeting Midoriya halfway. Kirishima watched Bakugo envelope Midoriya in his arms, carrying him bridal style as he braced and landed in a run back to the mats. "What the hell?" Kirishima yelled as he ran towards them. Bakugo let Midoriya down, feet landing solidly on the mat. Midoriya opened his eyes and grinned wide at Bakugo. "Hey, Kirishima-kun." Midoriya waved. "Come to work out?" "Dude!" Kirishima cried. "What the hell was that? You just and he what?" "Trust falls." Bakugo supplied, looking completely calm, if slightly irritated that Kirishima had interrupted them. "Trust falls." Kirishima felt dizzy from shock and confusion, and the fact that he'd suddenly become the most reasonable person in the room. "Midoriya-kun, could I talk to you over there for a second?" Midoriya shrugged, and together they walked back over towards the doors at the front of the gym. Bakugo walked the other way toward where they'd set down their water bottles. "Midoriya," Kirishima said, "please tell me you see how this is wildly unorthodox." Midoriya shrugged again. He gripped the hem of his shirt and wiped a little at his neck. His bright green eyes peered over to where Bakugo was downing some of his water. A soft, thoughtful look passed over Midoriya's face. "I think," Midoriya said a little quietly, still keeping his eyes on his childhood friend, "that this is something akin to an apology for Kakin." Kirishima stayed silent at this. The best thing was just to listen to Midoriya at this point. Bakugo was complex and abstract in so many wordless ways, but Midoriya knew him inside and out. If anyone could explain him, it was Izuku. "He wants to make sure that I know I can trust him in a fight. And I already do. But lately we've been trying to talk about the past. Trying to make amends and explain ourselves, I guess." Midoriya scratched at the back of his head, sighing. "It's rough. Some nights it gets too hard, and we both want to walk away from this. But Kakin and I come here instead. Because even if at the end of the night we still can't talk anymore, at least we walk away knowing infallibly that we'll always have each other's backs." When Midoriya finally looked back at Kirishima, looked him in the face, he was startled to see Kirishima wiping at his eyes. "Kirishima-kun?" Kirishima laughed lightheartedly. And when he looked at Midoriya again, he was smiling this broad, proud smile. Even if it was a little watery. "It really gets me to see you guys working things out." Kirishima told him earnestly. "Alright, well I'll let you guys get back to it. Thanks for telling me, Midoriya-kun." Midoriya smiled warmly at his red-headed friend. "Of course, I'm glad you worry for him, too, Kirishima-kun. Thank you." And then he was running back over to Bakugo, calling to switch off. Bakugo grumbled something back and went over to the wall, where he began climbing a set of ladders to the rafters. Kirishima went to work by the weight machines. "You hurt him, you die," Uraraka says to Bakugo, a few weeks after the two boys had become real and true friends. It was an odd moment for Bakugo, because it was during their lunch PRD and it had been a normal day. A little rainy and humid, but that wasn't anything significant. Midoriya had been his usual smiling self. Bakugo had sat down with Midoriya and his other friends for lunch, as he sometimes did these days. It kind of alternated. Some days Bakugo sat with Midoriya's friends, some days Midoriya sat with Bakugo's friends, although Bakugo's friends were really Midoriya's friends too. Some days they sat apart, but it was never for too long. Usually Bakugo would get into an argument with Shiro or Kaminari, and call Midoriya in for backup. Or Midoriya would tell Ida and Uraraka and Todoroki about a movie Katsuki and him had seen the night before, and would call over to Bakugo to fact-check something about the movie or someone that had been in it. But on this particular day, Midoriya had stepped out to discuss an assignment with Professor Aizawa, which left Bakugo with Uraraka and Ida and Todoroki. He was not prepared for the moment that Uraraka turned deathly serious and threatened his life if he ever so much as looked at Midoriya the wrong way ever again. He was also not prepared for when she, Ida, and Todoroki had all simultaneously pulled identical pairs of sunglasses out of hidden places and slipped them on like they'd coordinated this. Todoroki pulled a water gun with a bad paint job out of his bag. Ida pulled a minuscule cheese knife out of his pocket. Uraraka hefted a cooking pan out of her bag. Each of them set their weapons of choice on the table like they were making an offer that Bakugo couldn't refuse. After a long, ridiculous moment of Bakugo staring incredulously at each of them and them staring impassively back at him through their tacky shades, Uraraka and her goons slowly pulled their weapons back and concealed them again. "I think we understand each other," Uraraka said ominously. Bakugo couldn't help it. He burst out laughing. Ida redrew his cheese knife and held it out like he was prepared to gut someone with it. Bakugo just laughed harder. At this point, he was starting to attract attention to himself. It wasn't every day that Bakugo could be found laughing unguardedly. Even less common, he was laughing without Deku around. All right, he sighed, eventually, dabbing at the corners of his eyes with a napkin dramatically. He smiled good-naturedly. Uraraka lowered her shades at the sight, disbelieving that Bakugo would ever brandish such a soft look. "Listen, round face," she huffed indignantly at that, "I'm not gonna hurt Deku." "I wouldn't." Uraraka stared at him skeptically, shades still lowered on her nose. Beside her, Todoroki had subtly elbowed Ida and the two of them slipped off their shades and tucked them away as quietly as they could. Katsuki looked at her like it was the most obvious thing in the world. "Because Deku's my best friend," he answered. Behind them, there was a tremendous crash. Bakugo spun around, and the other three shot to their feet. "Deku!" Uraraka called in concern. She leaped over the table and ran to his side, just as Bakugo kneeled to his side too. Midoriya was face down on the floor, ears red as tomatoes. "What the hell, Deku?" Uraraka and Bakugo helped him to his feet, and Todoroki shoved napkins in Midoriya's hands when they realized his nose was bleeding. "I'll help you to the nurse's office," Bakugo said. Uraraka offered to go with them, but Bakugo snapped that he could handle it by himself. Midoriya stayed entirely silent, face in flames of what everyone perceived to be embarrassment. Bakugo walked him to the nurse, half-jokingly offering to carry him, but Midoriya gave him a weak look of disdain and they walked on together in silence. Midoriya kept the napkins pressed to his nose, other hand pinching the bridge of his nose to help stop the bleeding. Bakugo kept glancing at him out of the corner of his eye. "What's the matter with you?" he asked after a few long minutes of uneasy silence. It wasn't like Midoriya to be quiet for long periods of time. "I haven't seen you this clumsy since our first few months here." Midoriya's face deepened in shades of red. "Well?" Bakugo demanded, stepping in front of his childhood friend to stop him in place. He couldn't shake the feeling that Midoriya was being short with him. Had it been something Aizawa said to him? Was he really that embarrassed because he tripped in the lunchroom? "Did you mean it?" Midoriya asked, finally looking Bakugo full in the face for the first time since he left the cafeteria that day. "Mean what?" Bakugo said immediately, not really thinking. He hadn't said anything of consequence in the last few minutes. "What you said back there. In the cafeteria," Midoriya said, and though his face still glowed red, he was determined. "What I said in the cafeteria? Because Deku's my best friend. Of course I meant it. Bakugo said defensively, like Deku had just accused him of something, of lying. I wouldn't have said it if I didn't, you know that. The line of Midoriya's mouth trembled a little at the edges, but he nodded his acceptance. If Bakugo didn't know any better, he would have thought Deku was smiling. But Midoriya stepped around him and past him, walking toward the nurse's door. He's my best friend. Bakugo thought to himself. It wasn't a lie. It was the absolute truth. He'd known it for a while now, but thinking now of Midoriya's reaction, how he tripped over his own feet at the admission. He realized it might have only been obvious to him. They'd been sleeping in each other's rooms lately, for crying out loud. They stayed up and watched movies together, and analyzed hero fights together, and trained until the late hours of the night together. There was no one Bakugo would rather have watching his back, and he knew it was the same for Midoriya. When Bakugo turned around to follow him, a little startled by this whole diamond exchange, he found Midoriya smiling to himself. Something in Bakugo's chest tightened at the sight. Midoriya put his hand on the nurse's door, but paused at the last second. He looked over at Bakugo and grinned widely. You're my best friend too. And then he disappeared into the room, the door closing behind him, leaving Bakugo out in the hallway alone, his face feeling strangely warm and his chest feeling uncomfortably tight. He thought.